She was about to hang, moments after birth, until he ripped through the crowd and pulled her down. They gathered just after sunrise, when the gallows creaked against the chill and the dirt still held the night's frost. And she stood barefoot on the planks, with her newborn still slick with birth blood in her arms. The noose dangling not inches from her throat, but wrapped already around her bruised collar. Her gown half torn from the delivery that had taken place less than an hour before. And the sheriff barked something about frontier justice. But no one remembered the words, because the baby cried. Weakly, painfully. And no one moved to take it from her before the drop. Until one man did. He didn't shout, didn't speak, just slammed through the knot of onlookers like a horse breaking tack. His boots thundering on the wooden stage as the hangman reached for the lever and the sheriff turned too slow. And before the rope could be tightened another inch, the stranger drew a knife from his belt and slashed the hemp clean, catching the woman mid-fall in one massive arm while the baby slipped from her chest into the other, the crowd gasping as if breath itself had been cut. "You'll hang too," someone shouted. But the man didn't flinch, just stared through the dust at the sheriff with the eyes of someone who'd seen gallows before and never lost sleep after burning them down. "That ain't your woman," the sheriff said, stepping forward, hand hovering near his revolver. "Ain't your fight." But the mountain of a man didn't respond. He turned, holding mother and child, as if carrying only wind and silence, and stepped off the stage as the hangman backed away, and someone in the crowd spit in the dirt. The townspeople watched, stunned, as he walked straight through them, not fast, not afraid, like a man who'd already decided what blood was worth and what wasn't. A rifle cracked somewhere, someone panicked, but the shot went high, and by the time the posse remembered how to move, the man had mounted a wide-shouldered buckskin horse with her balanced in front of him and the child pressed between them. The last thing anyone saw before he vanished down the southern trail was the way the baby's fist curled into the man's beard and how he adjusted the coat around them without breaking stride. And somewhere behind them, the sheriff swore and called for riders, but no one moved, not yet. For they'd all just witnessed something that didn't fit into law or sin or justice. A man who'd chosen mercy at the gallows. The forest didn't ask questions as they rode into it, branches brushing past like hands too kind to strike. But the woman clung to the man's coat with the same desperate grip she'd used on the noose. Her breath jagged, her body wrecked from childbirth. And still she hadn't spoken a word. Not when he pulled her from death, not during the flight through dust and gunfire, not even now as the child whimpered weakly against her chest, wrapped in the flannel lining of his coat. She'd been condemned for a reason, that much the man knew. Towns didn't hang women lightly, not even out here where decency stretched thinner than fence wire. But he hadn't asked why. He didn't need to, not yet. They rode until the shadows grew longer than the trail, then stopped by a dry creek bed where the trees grew thick and the world forgot how to echo. And only then did he set her down, gently like she might shatter from wind. "Name," he said finally, his voice like stone dragged across timber, and she flinched. "Mara," she whispered, and then it broke. Everything. "They said I'd killed the man," she choked out, her fingers trembling as she tucked the baby closer. "Said he was the father, and when he died bleeding in the cabin with his pants still open." She stopped, swallowed, shook her head. No one listened. No one saw. The mountain man didn't move, didn't offer comfort, just stared with eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by cruelty. She blinked hard, lips cracked, voice low. "He took me in the hay barn. I was 16. He said no one would believe a dumb girl who cleaned stables." The baby fussed, and she rocked gently, tears cutting tracks through dried blood. They buried him and blamed me, said I'd seduced him and slit his gut with his own knife. I hadn't even held a blade. She looked up then, expecting judgment, maybe pity, but finding neither. Only the steady weight of a man who wasn't interested in excuses, only in what came next. He got what he earned, the mountain man said flatly. And you ain't hanging for it. Mara stared, disbelief mixing with something dangerous, hope. Why'd you pull me down? She whispered. You don't know me. He reached into his pack, tore a strip of clean cloth, and handed it to her. 'Cause I saw a rope round your neck and a baby still crying, he muttered. Didn't need more than that. And as the fire crackled low beside them and darkness crept over the woods, Mara realized no one had ever said words like that to her. Not in truth, not with fists down and eyes level. The posse rode out at first light, 10 men thick with dust and iron nerves, their rifles oiled and tempers dry as gunpowder. While back at the gallows, the sheriff spat blood from a split lip and swore that no woman thief and baby snatcher would outpace him twice in the same lifetime. Tracks were easy to follow. Blood, boot prints, a small foot pressed once in soft earth where Mara had dismounted to calm the child. And by mid-morning, the trail curved south past the creek bed and into the low pines where the shadows didn't move unless the wind told them to. Jonah Creed didn't talk much as they rode, his eyes scanning tree lines, ears tuned to the silence between bird calls. The child still pressed close to Mara's breast, his heartbeat thudding loud against her ribs. She'd asked his name once before sunrise and gotten a single word in return. Jonah. With no last name, no reason, no story. He didn't need one, not yet. What he gave her instead was movement. The rhythm of horse hooves that didn't falter, the way his knife never left his belt loop, the way he kept her on the windward side to shield her from cold without ever saying why. Behind them, the riders grew closer. Jonah could hear them now. Branches snapping too clean, the faint squeal of a bit being pulled too hard, the bark of a man cursing at a low branch that caught his coat. He turned slightly in the saddle, and Mara caught the shift in his jaw, the tension that said, "It's time." They left the trail without warning, pushing through thick underbrush, burrs snagging her gown and pine sap marking his coat, until they reached a low ravine carved by last spring's melt, and Jonah slid off the horse, lifted both mother and child down with one arm, and guided them to a hollow beneath the roots of a fallen cedar. "Don't cry," he said softly, not to her, but to the baby, as he tucked them inside the shadowed earth, then unhooked his rifle and stepped back toward the trail. "What are you going to do?" Mara asked, voice tight. Jonah checked the breech, snapped it shut. "Remind him I wasn't finished fightin'." She wanted to call him mad, wanted to scream that they should run, but something in her stilled. A memory of how his arms had held her on the gallows, not as a stranger saves a burden, but as if he'd done this before, many times, and always survived. The baby cooed softly, unaware of the world's sharp edge, and as Jonah vanished up the slope, Mara held her breath and prayed that whatever past he came from had taught him how to kill without becoming the thing that made him need to. They didn't hear gunfire, not at first. Only the sudden flurry of crows lifting from the treetops like they'd been warned by something older than bullets. And Mara gripped the baby tighter in the hollow beneath the cedar. The smell of old roots and wet earth thick in her nose, her body tensed like it remembered ropes and screaming and didn't care that this time she was hidden. When the first shot did echo, a deep-throated crack followed by 2 sharper reports, her breath caught, but the baby stirred only faintly, more tired than frightened. It wasn't until twilight bled into the ravine that Jonah returned, silent as mist, dragging behind him a single loose rifle and a torn coat that didn't belong to him. "How many?" she asked, voice tight. "3 won't ride again," he said simply, setting the rifle down and crouching beside her. He didn't explain the others, didn't boast or warn. Instead, he pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and a small sack wrapped in cloth. Inside it, a rough heel of bread, stale but clean, and a small strip of smoked venison. He broke the bread without speaking and handed it to her first, eyes not on her mouth, but the baby's tiny fingers reaching toward the steam of the water she poured over her wrist to test. "They'll keep coming," she murmured between chews, guilt souring her tongue even as hunger pushed her forward. "Sheriff won't stop until he's seen me swing." Jonah nodded once, pulled a small flint from his pocket, and lit a fire the size of a lantern flame, sheltered beneath a half circle of stones. "Then we keep moving." "Why?" she said again, more raw now. "Why are you doing this? I could be lying. I could have killed him." Jonah looked up at her finally, and in the firelight, his face wasn't just rough, it was wounded, the kind of haunted that doesn't fade when you sleep. "You didn't," he said simply. "Men like him think taking don't cost nothing. You were the cost." She stared at him, the food forgotten in her hand, the baby's breath soft against her chest. No one had ever said it so plain, like it was fact instead of a maybe. He stood, shouldered the rifle, then paused. "I had a sister," he added, voice like a distant drumbeat. "She didn't make it to a rope. Nobody pulled her down." Then he turned to check the horses, leaving her to the fire, the food, and a name she didn't know how to mourn. And that night, as the baby slept between them and the wind curled through the pines like an old hymn, Mara finally leaned into sleep without flinching, the taste of bread still on her tongue and the scent of smoke spelling safety for the first time. By dawn, the snow line crept lower, not deep enough to track by boot, but enough to whisper that winter was coming faster than expected. And Jonah knew they had only a day or two before the ridgelines froze and movement turned suicidal. Yet behind them, the riders didn't slow. The sheriff had split his men into pairs now, pushing them wide across the basin, using back trails and hunting paths, like he knew the land better than the wolves. And Jonah could feel them tightening the noose, not with speed, but with calculation. He didn't tell Mara that. Just motioned her onto the saddle and kept the baby tucked between them, riding north by instinct, toward an old trapper's lean-to he hadn't seen in 5 winters, but hoped still stood. The woods grew denser, muffling their trail, but Jonah's shoulders tensed with every twig snap, every echo that didn't belong. Mara noticed the change, how often he scanned the trees, how little he spoke. And it settled over her like ash, the knowledge that their window was closing. "You ever kill a lawman?" she asked as they reached a frost-bitten creek, the water sluggish under a crust of ice. "Not yet," Jonah said, dismounting to let the horse drink. "But I've buried men who wore badges and forgot what they meant." She didn't ask again. The baby whimpered from cold and hunger, and Mara rocked gently, her lips cracked, hands raw. Jonah handed her the last piece of jerky, and though he hadn't eaten since before the hanging, he didn't touch his half. The shelter came just before dusk, half collapsed but dry. And Jonah worked fast, patching the roof with pine boughs, while Mara lit the fire with what kindling she could gather. It wasn't comfort, but it was pause. That night, Jonah set traps and strung a tin cup on a thread outside the lean-to's edge. Not much, but enough to wake him. "They'll be close by now," he said as they sat in silence, flames low. Too close to outrun if we don't move at first light. Then we don't sleep, she replied, eyes dark from everything but fear. He's not just hunting me. He's hunting shame. That town watched him let it happen. If I live, they all hang with me. Jonah didn't argue. Instead, he reached over, dipped a rag into warm water, and gently cleaned the baby's cheeks. Then let him try. The words weren't threat or promise. They were simply fact, spoken by a man who'd once been hunted himself and had lived long enough to become the thing hunters feared most. And outside, just past the fire's light, a twig snapped. They made it as far as the river ford before the riders caught up. And even then, it wasn't speed that betrayed them. It was silence, the kind that drops too suddenly, the kind that tells you men are waiting just beyond the bend. Jonah felt it before he saw it, his horse stiffening beneath him, ears twitching toward a part of the woods that hadn't made a sound in minutes. And he turned to Mara with a glance sharp enough to slice through doubt. Dismount. Take the baby. Stay low. She didn't ask questions, just slid off the saddle, tucked the child close, and slipped behind the boulders edging the muddy crossing, while Jonah stepped out into the open, his rifle slung but hand ready. The sheriff was first to appear, flanked by two men with carbines already aimed, their faces worn and red from cold, but eyes locked like hunting dogs. "You're done running, Creed," the sheriff called out, voice echoing off water and stone. "Ain't no man carries a whore and a bastard through winter without bleedin' for it." Jonah didn't flinch. "Ain't no law hangs a mother with a child still nursin' unless it's afraid of what the child might grow into." The words landed heavy, and the sheriff's jaw clenched. "She killed one of ours." "She survived one of yours," Jonah corrected. "Ain't the same thing. That's when the bullet flew. Not from the sheriff, but one of his deputies. Jumpy and young, the shot cracking through branches and skimming Jonah's left arm just enough to tear fabric and draw blood. In the same second, Jonah dove sideways, rolled, came up firing, one clean shot through the chest of the shooter, the boy folding without a sound. Then it turned to chaos. Another rider charged from the tree line, but his horse stumbled in the mud and pitched forward. Jonah was on his feet before the man could rise, boot crushing hand before he could reach his gun. Mara screamed, not from pain, but from where she saw two men flank the boulders, heading toward her and the baby. She didn't wait. She grabbed a stick half her size and swung wild, catching one man across the jaw with a crack that snapped bone or teeth or both. The other tackled her, shoving her into the dirt, and the baby tumbled from her arms with a high, startled cry. But then came Jonah, roaring like a man who'd just seen his own blood on a child's face, and he hit the attacker with a full charge that sent them both into the river. When it was over, the sheriff was gone, ridden off when the first deputy fell, and 3 of his men lay still in the frost while Jonah stood soaked to the chest, holding the baby high above the waterline as Mara sobbed into the bank. He said nothing. He just handed her the child, bleeding from the arm and breathing like the earth owed him something, and he'd come to collect. They found shelter in a burnt-out chapel 2 miles past the river. Roof half collapsed, pews rotted, pulpit scorched from a lightning fire that had struck years ago. But the stone walls still stood, and Jonah pushed through them like a man carrying more than blood, one arm wrapped tight to stop the bleeding, the other guiding Mara and the baby inside as the wind howled through the bones of the place, like it remembered sermons and screams both. He said nothing as he dropped to his knees, biting down hard as she tore cloth from her own dress to staunch the wound. And she worked fast, panic moving through her fingers as she pressed against flesh that refused to stop weeping. "You should have run," she muttered, voice shaking. "Left me, saved yourself." Jonah didn't open his eyes. "Then I'd be sleeping alone in the dirt tonight," he rasped. "Ain't interested in that kind of rest." She tightened the knot, his breath hitching sharp. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just in her hands, but in her eyes. In the way she looked at him, like he wasn't just the man who saved her, but someone who'd been saving pieces of himself every time he chose not to leave. The baby whimpered in her sling, cold and confused, and Jonah forced himself upright, leaning against the stone altar like a man offering penance. "I ever tell you why I know how to fire 6 rounds with one hand?" he asked suddenly, voice low and scraped thin. "My mother died swinging for a man's crime. My pa shot the marshal on the gallows steps trying to cut her down. They hung him too a week later. I was 10. I watched both drops." Mara stared at him, her hands falling from the bandage. "You pulled me down because no one pulled them," she whispered. He nodded once, jaw tight. "Figured I owed somebody?" She crossed to him slowly, sat beside him on the cold stone floor, and placed the baby between them. "Then you paid it," she said. "And I'm still here." Outside, the storm built into a quiet fury. Snow starting to fall in thick, silent sheets that erased the trail behind them. And for the first time since she'd met him, Jonah leaned his head back against the wall and let his eyes close. Not in surrender, but in trust. And Mara reached for his hand, not to hold it, but to warm it, because she finally understood the truth he wouldn't say. A man who chooses mercy over revenge is already half healed. And the woman who sees it is already halfway home. They came at dawn again, as if the gallows had sent a ghost to finish what the rope failed to do. 4 riders this time, armed, silent, deliberate, cresting the ridge above the chapel ruins with rifles slung low and eyes narrowed against the snow. And Jonah saw them the moment the first sunlight cut through the shattered rafters. He didn't speak. He stood, bandaged arm stiff but ready, and checked the chamber of his revolver like a priest counting sins he was finally willing to confess. "Stay behind the altar," he told Mara, voice iron flat. "If they shoot, crawl north through the graveyard. Stones will block the shots." Mara didn't argue. She crouched beside the stone pulpit, pressing the baby to her chest, heart thundering louder than the wind howling through the chapel's broken teeth. The riders stopped 10 paces from the edge, snow rising in soft clouds around their boots, and the lead man dismounted, broad-shouldered, older, not the sheriff but worse, a hired killer with no badge and no soul left to sell. "You Creed?" the man asked, spitting in the snow. "Don't matter," Jonah replied. "You come for the woman, that's all I need to know." The man grinned, showing teeth like split fence posts. "That woman's worth 500 alive, 3 if she's dead. Judge don't care which." Jonah stepped forward, revolver still down, but his stance coiled like a snake near the strike. "Then I reckon the judge can come collect her himself," he said. "But he'll have to step over 4 graves to do it." The silence cracked then, not from a bullet, but from the tension that broke just before blood does. The gunman raised his arm and shouted, "Take 'em!" But Jonah was already moving, drawing and firing in one smooth motion, the first shot tearing through a rider's shoulder and sending him spinning. The second dropped another from his saddle before he even aimed. Chaos exploded. Snow kicked up with hooves and muzzle flash, the sound of wood splintering and steel biting air. And Jonah moved through it like a ghost with weight, unstoppable, wounded, righteous. One rider made it inside the chapel, boots thudding on broken pews, and Mara screamed, shielding the baby. But then Jonah was there, slamming the man's head into the stone pulpit hard enough to end the threat before the pistol even cleared its holster. When the smoke cleared, 3 men bled into the snow, and the 4th, gut shot, crawled toward his rifle, gasping. Jonah stood over him, hand shaking from blood loss, and the man looked up, eyes wild. "Do it," he spat. "You want mercy, you don't come here," Jonah said. But then he stepped back. "Tell your judge she ain't dying in the cold, and neither am I." And with that, Jonah walked back inside, sat down beside Mara, and whispered the first word the baby ever heard from his lips. Safe. The bodies were buried in the chapel graveyard before noon, not with ceremony, but with silence. Jonah digging one-armed, while Mara wrapped the baby in a wool blanket, warmed by the last embers of a fire, too tired to roar. The snowfall easing as if the sky had finally seen enough. No words were carved into the stones, just rough markers and a single shared truth. They hadn't left her to die. Jonah said nothing as he filled the last grave. Sweat freezing to his brow, blood still seeping through the bandage at his side, and Mara didn't ask him to stop. She only watched, holding the child close, her feet planted firm in the snow as if claiming the land inch by inch. When he was done, Jonah sat beside her on the chapel steps, shoulders sagging not from pain, but from the weight of days spent running from justice that had never looked like truth. "We can't stay here," she said quietly. "The sheriff, he won't stop." Jonah nodded once, then surprised her by pulling a small folded paper from his coat. A land deed, smudged but legal, marked with a trailman's stamp. "I was heading to Bitter Creek," he said. "Cabin there's half standing, land's clean, no town for miles." "You were going alone?" she asked. "Was," he replied. "Ain't now." She didn't speak right away. She looked down at the child, at the faint scar on his forehead from the fall, then back at Jonah, and the answer passed between them without needing words. "They'll say I seduced you," she said, voice low. "Say I used the baby to trap you into protecting me." Jonah leaned back against the wall, the wind softening. "Then let 'em come say it to my face." It was the closest thing to a vow he'd ever spoken, and it sat heavy in the air, solid as the stone under them. The baby stirred, reaching out with one chubby hand toward the bandage at Jonah's side. And Mara laughed for the first time since the gallows, a short, cracked sound that caught in her throat. "You got a name for him?" Jonah asked. She hesitated. "Was going to call him Eli, after my brother. He died in a barn fire when we were kids. No one ever said his name again." Jonah nodded, then repeated it like it belonged to the boy now. "Eli Creed." She looked up sharply, eyes shining. "Creed?" "If you want it," Jonah said. "If you want us." And for the first time, she didn't feel like something that had been taken. She felt like something someone had chosen to keep. The storm passed by dusk, leaving only ash and frost behind, but inside the chapel there was firelight. They reached Bitter Creek at the edge of spring, when the last snow still clung to the north sides of the hills like old regrets that hadn't quite let go. And the cabin was worse than Jonah remembered, half the roof gone, porch caved in, door hanging from one hinge. But Mara looked at it like it was a castle, the kind you build from what's left, not what's perfect. Jonah set to work before the horse even cooled, chopping wood with one good arm, patching the roof with whatever scraps he could find in the nearby timberline. And Mara swept out the dust and mice droppings with a branch broom, humming to the baby strapped against her chest. They didn't talk about what came next. They just did it. Like people who'd survived enough to know that peace isn't promised. It's built nail by nail. By the third day, the hearth burned clean, and the smoke curled from the chimney like it belonged there. Mara lined the windows with spare cloth to keep the drafts out, and Jonah dug a new wellhead closer to the door, grunting through the pain, but refusing to stop. On the 6th morning, she came outside to find him carving a cradle from a fallen aspen, smoothing the edges with a stone. "It's not much," he said without looking up. "It's more than anyone's ever made for him," she replied. That night, they sat on the rebuilt porch, the baby asleep between them in a basket padded with horse blankets, the stars so wide above that silence became comfort, not threat. Mara leaned into Jonah's shoulder, still wary of what might come, but no longer afraid of it. "You think they'll follow us?" she asked. Jonah took a long breath. "Maybe," he said. "But men who chase shadows don't last long in daylight." She smiled at that, small, tired, real. "Then we stay in the light," she said. "For him, for us." The wind shifted, warmer now, carrying the scent of thawed pine and wet earth. And somewhere in the distance, an owl called once before falling quiet. Jonah wrapped an arm around her, drawing her close, and whispered the only blessing he knew. "Ain't no rope holding you now." And for the first time since the gallows, Mara believed it. Not just because she was breathing, but because she'd been pulled down by someone who knew that saving a life was only the beginning. It was building a fire, a name, a home. If this story touched your heart, ride with us again. Like, share, and subscribe. And visit the channel for full cinematic long stories.